Rose and Frank had been together for over 40 years. Their lives flowed at their own measured pace, and although they had weathered many storms together, now all that remained of their former passion was a quiet routine. There was a silence in their house that had once brought Rosa peace, but now this silence oppressed her. She remembered the times when she and Frank could talk for hours, laugh, and discuss plans for the future. But now those times seemed far away and unattainable. Frank, a reliable and loyal man, always took care of Rose. He still loved her, although he expressed this love more through actions than through words. Every morning he got up early, made coffee and put her favorite cup on the table, not forgetting to add sugar the way she liked. They lived in a house on the outskirts of the city, where they spent their whole lives, raised children who have long since moved to different cities. Their days were predictable, as were their lives. Rosa, sitting by the window in the living room, looked sadly at the old garden. The summer day was warm and quiet, but instead of enjoying the sun and peace, she felt a strange emptiness inside. Her world narrowed down to the walls of the house, to the usual actions that she performed every day. She felt that something important had gone out of her life, something that she and Frank had lost a long time ago, but had never been able to get back. Frank came into the room with a newspaper in his hands, settling into his chair as usual. He quietly read a couple of news items without raising his head, and only occasionally glanced in the direction of Rosa.
You're kind of thoughtful today. Rosa, is everything okay?
She looked up at her husband, slightly surprised by his question, but only nodded, not wanting to delve into her feelings.
Yes, I'm just thinking about how things have changed. Our children, this house. Everything has become different, and we are older.
Frank, as always, remained unperturbed. For him, old age and these changes were just a part of life. He had always believed that both of them should accept their fate and not try to bring back the past.
Well, yes, time does not stand still, but we're fine. Home, peace of mind, health. Isn't that enough?
His words should have been comforting, but to Rose they seemed just another reminder of how far they had come from each other. She knew that Frank still loved her, in his own way, but his love had not brought her the warmth that it had at the beginning of their journey for a long time. All that's left are habits, routine, and each other's silent presence in the house. She couldn't say exactly when their marriage began to lose its former passion. Perhaps it started when the children grew up and left home, or when they both plunged into work and then into a quiet old age. Rosa felt that their relationship had long since lost the intimacy that once bound them. They began to coexist more than live together, and it depressed her. Frank, noticing that she was lost in thought, folded the newspaper and moved closer to her. He wanted to talk to her, but he didn't know how. It was difficult for him to express his feelings in words, and although he saw that something had changed in Rose, he could not figure out how to fix it.
I know we're not the same people we used to be, but that's okay. Rose, as we age, our lives change, but that doesn't mean it's bad.
Rosa looked at him with a slight sadness. She understood his point of view, but she couldn't share it. Life has changed for her, and not for the better. She felt that she had missed something important, something that she would not be able to get back. Her old age and routine life made her invisible even to herself.
You're right. Frank, we are not who we used to be. But sometimes it seems to me that we have lost something important. When was the last time we talked about anything other than kids or housework?
Frank looked at her blankly. He had never thought about their lives from that point of view. For him, their time together was quite stable, and it gave him a sense of satisfaction. He always believed that if they were together, then everything was fine.
I thought we always talk when we need to. We've known each other all our lives. Isn't that enough?
Rosa suppressed a sigh with difficulty. She understood that Frank was right in his own way, but for her, enough had not been something that suited her for a long time. She felt lonely more and more often, even when she was with him. She could not leave the thought that her life had lost its meaning, and that the things that once brought her joy now only remind her of the past years. Several days have passed, but these conversations have not led to a change in their relationship. Rosa immersed herself in everyday affairs, trying not to think about her experiences, but inside her there was a longing for life that was no longer here. Her familiar world has become too small for her. She felt that her days were filled only with waiting for the next morning, and every morning became a continuation of this endless emptiness. One day, when Rosa was baking a pie in the kitchen, the phone rang. She wiped her hands on a towel and went to the phone. On the other end of the line was her nephew, Marcus. He had recently graduated from college and was now looking for a job, as well as temporary housing, until he got a permanent job. Marcus offered to come to them for a while, and Rosa gladly agreed. She was pleased to hear his voice, and the thought that a young man would appear in their house, at least for a short time, brought her a feeling of something new. When Frank returned home, Rosa told him about Marcus's call. He didn't mind his nephew staying with them for a while. It was normal for them to help the family when needed. But for Rosa, Marcus's arrival has become more than just a family obligation. She felt a slight excitement at the upcoming changes, at the fact that her life would finally stop being so predictable. Marcus arrived a week later. Young, full of energy and life plans, he immediately brought a sense of movement into the house. He helped Rosa around the house, talked about his dreams and plans, joked and laughed, making her remember her youth. Frank treated him with respect, although he did not share his enthusiasm. For him, life had long been calm and measured, and he did not seek changes. Within a few weeks, Rosa and Marcus became close. She rejoiced at his attention, his youthful enthusiasm, and a view of the world that was full of hope. Her days became brighter. She began to feel alive again. They spent a lot of time together, talking, remembering family stories. In these conversations, Rosa regained that sense of emotional intimacy that she had long lost with Frank. Frank, although he saw his wife brighten up next to Marcus, did not attach any importance to this. It was natural for him. Rosa had always loved her nephews, and he did not see anything unusual in their communication. But Rose, without realizing it, was beginning to feel more than just a kinship for Marcus. Her heart was starting to beat faster again, and her thoughts kept returning to how she felt around Marcus. It was a dangerous feeling that she tried to stifle, but she couldn't. Two worlds were fighting inside her, one the familiar, calm, her life with Frank, and the other full of new emotions and feelings that she had not experienced for a long time. Gradually, Rose began to realize that her attraction to Marcus was getting stronger. She tried to deal with it by reminding herself that it was wrong, but every time they were alone, her feelings became more complicated and confusing. Marcus, in turn, also began to notice that something more than just a family connection was emerging between them. Several months passed, and Rosa found herself on the verge of internal conflict. She felt torn between two men, her husband, with whom she had lived all her life, and a young nephew who brought back feelings she had long forgotten into her life. It's been a few weeks since Rose and Frank found out about Marcus's arrival. The excitement and sense of expectation in the air warmed up the atmosphere of their home. For Rosa, it was a rare opportunity to feel the young energy again, which had not been in her life for a long time. Frank, although he was not so enthusiastic, calmly agreed to his nephew's visit, considering it an ordinary family support. Marcus, the son of Rosa's sister, was young, full of energy and ambition. He had just graduated from college, and like many graduates, he was looking for a job and his place in life. He had no definite plans, but he had a great desire to start a new chapter in his life. When he called Aunt Rosa to ask if he could stay with them for a while he was looking for a job, Rosa immediately agreed. For her, it was not just an offer of hospitality, it was a chance to change the boring routine that filled her life for a while. The day Marcus arrived was sunny and warm. Rosa fussed around the house in the morning, putting everything in order, even though the house was already clean. She was looking forward to his arrival, as if it was a guest she had long dreamed of seeing. Frank, on the other hand, remained calm, although he noticed her agitation. Marcus arrived in an old car that had clearly seen better days. When he got out of the car, his tall figure and youthful energy were immediately evident. He looked like a man full of hopes and plans for the future, despite the uncertainty that hung over his head. Rosa, seeing him, immediately headed for the door, her face lit up with a smile.
Hello, Aunt Rosa, I finally got there.
He came over and hugged her. His warmth and enthusiasm infected her.
Marcus, I'm so glad to see you. Come on, dear, your house is yours. Make yourself at home.
Marcus nodded, smiling, and turned to Frank, who was standing a little further away, watching their meeting. Uncle Frank, how are you? It's good to see you again. Frank reached out and shook his nephew's hand, smiling slightly.
Hi, Marcus. It's good that you came. I hope the journey wasn't too tiring.
Not much, but it's nothing. The main thing is that I'm here.
Frank nodded, and Rose hurried to lead Marcus into the house, showing him his room. The room was small but cozy, with a view of the garden. For Marcus, it was the perfect place to stay for a while. He was glad that he could stay with his aunt and uncle while he was looking for a job and deciding where to move on. After Marcus had settled in, Rosa invited him into the kitchen, where a hot dinner was already waiting. It was one of those rare evenings when the house seemed full of life. Rosa, usually silent and thoughtful, became animated by the presence of her nephew. She enjoyed watching him joke and talk about his college adventures. Frank also listened, albeit with restraint, but his presence added to the family atmosphere of the moment. After dinner, they all sat down together in the living room. Marcus continued to talk about his plans, shared his thoughts about where he wants to direct his career. Rosa listened attentively, her eyes glittering with interest. She had not heard such a thirst for life and ambition for a long time.
I think I will look for a job in the advertising field. It is a dynamic and creative environment. I learned a lot in college, and I want to apply all my skills.
That sounds great, Marcus. You've always been so single-minded. I'm sure you'll do well.
Frank, although less involved in the conversation, also nodded approvingly.
Yes, it's not easy to find a job nowadays, but you can handle your enthusiasm. The main thing is not to give up.
Marcus smiled, feeling the family's support.
Thank you. Uncle Frank, I'm glad you accepted me. It's really a big help for me.
The first few days after Marcus's arrival were uneventful. He started looking for a job, sent out his resume and went for interviews. Rose, on the other hand, was happy that she had someone at home again to talk to, laugh with and just spend time with. Marcus's youthful energy seemed to revive her. She noticed that she began to feel more cheerful and happy. Frank, for his part, remained calm and, as usual, preoccupied with his own affairs. He wasn't particularly involved in the family dynamic, although he couldn't help but notice that Rosa was starting to spend more time with Marcus. They often talked, laughed, and cooked together, and Frank was glad that his wife had regained some joy in life. One evening, after Frank had gone to bed, Rosa and Marcus stayed in the kitchen to drink tea. Marcus was telling another funny story from his student life, and Rosa laughed, feeling how long it had been since she had experienced such emotions. She couldn't help but notice how much Marcus had grown and become a man. His confidence, his positive energy, all this attracted her, making her forget about her daily worries. Marcus, on the other hand, enjoyed talking to his aunt. For him, she was always not only a member of the family, but also a person who understood him. He felt that he could be honest with her, share his thoughts and plans.
You know, Aunt Rosa, I'm so glad I came here. Everything seems so complicated and fast in the city, but here, in your house, I feel calm.
Rosa looked at him with a smile, her heart warmed by his words.
You can always count on us, Marcus. This is your home as well as ours.
These words sounded sincere, but somewhere deep inside Rose began to realize that her affection for her nephew had become something more than just caring for a young relative. His presence gave her what she had been missing for a long time, a sense of importance, youth and emotional intimacy. Over the next few weeks, their communication became even closer. They spent a lot of time together, and Rosa increasingly noticed that her heart began to beat faster when Marcus was around. It was something new, unexpected and frightening. She tried to push those thoughts away, but they kept coming back over and over again. On the other hand, Marcus also began to notice that his aunt was not just an interesting conversationalist, but an attractive woman whose wisdom and care earned him respect. And something more. He didn't understand what was happening to him, but every touch, every smile of Rosa got more and more stuck in his thoughts. One evening, when they were alone again after dinner, their conversation took an unexpected direction. This was the moment when their emotional intimacy began to grow into something more.
Aunt Rosa, you are always so caring. I can't even imagine what I would do without you here. You're not just a relative to me. You've become something more to me.
Rose felt her heart tighten. She knew that this moment was inevitable. Her attraction to Marcus had become too strong to ignore.
Marcus,
She didn't know what to say, but they both already understood that their relationship had gone beyond simple communication. Marcus looked at her with a serious expression on his face, and in his eyes she saw what she was afraid to admit. They both felt the same way. It was a dangerous moment when reality began to lose its boundaries, and their bond became not just family, but emotional and, perhaps, something more than they could afford. The first weeks after Marcus arrived at Rose and Frank's house were filled with novelty and excitement. Rosa felt her familiar but long dilapidated life suddenly filled with colors. Marcus, young, full of energy and cheerfulness, brought with him an atmosphere of youth and activity. It was like a breath of fresh air for Rose, who had long been accustomed to monotonous days where conversations with Frank were reduced to just discussing household affairs and news. Rose noticed that her mood had improved noticeably. Making breakfast in the morning no longer seemed like a boring chore, and conversations at the kitchen table began to bring her pleasure again. Every day she spent with Marcus seemed like an event to her. They were often alone when Frank was busy with his own business, and their conversations became more and more deep and personal. Marcus, despite his youth, was an attentive listener. He was genuinely interested in his aunt's stories about her past, about how she and Frank built their lives, about how their children grew up. These conversations allowed Rosa to plunge back into memories, to feel that her life made sense, that her experience was valuable. One evening, when Frank left to meet with friends, Rosa and Marcus were alone again. They were sitting on the couch in the living room, and Rosa unfolded an old photo album that they hadn't opened for a long time. The album contained pictures from different years, Rose and Frank's wedding, childhood photos of their children, family holidays and trips. For Rosa, These were memories of days long gone, and for Marcus the story of his family, which he had always been curious about, but knew little about.
Aunt Rosa, you've had amazing times. I had no idea that your youth was so intense.
Rose smiled as she flipped through the pages of the album. Her gaze stopped at the photo where she and Frank were captured in their youth, happy, energetic, full of hope. For a second, she felt a pang of nostalgia.
Yes, there were times. Then everything seemed so simple and real. Frank and I dreamed of many things. We wanted to achieve everything. But right now, our lives are just going on as usual.
Marcus looked at his aunt, his eyes filled with attention and understanding.
I understand that everything changes over time, but this does not mean that everything is lost. After all, you have been together for so many years, and this is an incredible achievement.
Rose sighed, her fingers slowly stroking the old corner of the photo. A quiet storm was raging inside her. Marcus's words were true, but she knew that there was not the fullness of that truth that reflected her inner feelings. She loved Frank, but that love had long ago become something else. They became like two neighbors living in the same house, but who had long lost their emotional connection.
Yes, we are together. But sometimes I think we just got used to each other. At some point, the relationship turns into something ordinary, and you stop feeling like it's something special.
Marcus leaned closer to her, his face showing genuine concern.
It sounds like you're not getting satisfaction from it. Do you feel lonely?
The question caught Rose off guard. She hadn't expected such a direct question from Marcus, but there was so much tenderness and understanding in his words that she wanted to be honest.
Sometimes. Yes, sometimes I feel lonely, even though Frank is around. He was always caring, but we have long lost the intimacy that we had before. We just live. That's all.
Marcus listened in silence, his attention completely focused on Rose. He saw in her not only an aunt, but also a woman who was in pain, which was unfamiliar to him, but very real.
You deserve more. Aunt Rose, you deserve to be happy. I have always admired you, your wisdom, your kindness, and I'm sad to see that you feel that way.
These words penetrated right into Rose's heart. Her eyes were slightly moist, and she looked away so that Marcus wouldn't notice her tears. Her heart was touched, but at the same time she felt a growing attraction to her nephew, which was increasingly difficult to ignore.
Thank you, Marcus. You have no idea how much your attention means to me. You really care about me.
Marcus put his hand on hers, his touch soft and comforting. This gesture may have been intended as a sign of support, but it caused Rose to have a wave of emotions that she could not control.
I will always be there for you. Aunt Rosa, you are very important to me.
Rose felt the warmth of his hand on hers, and the touch made her heart beat faster. At that moment, she realized that their relationship had begun to go beyond the usual family connection. Her attraction to Marcus was growing every day, and she couldn't pretend anymore that it wasn't true. Several days passed, but the tension between Rose and Marcus only intensified. They continued to chat, share stories, laugh, but in each of their conversations there was a kind of hidden passion that both of them could not ignore. One evening, when Frank left for his meeting again, Rosa and Marcus were alone in the kitchen. They talked about Marcus's childhood, how he had always admired his aunt for her strength and wisdom in life.
You know, Aunt Rosa, when I was a kid, you were always an example to me. I always thought you were the strongest woman in the world. You've been through so much, and yet you've remained so kind and caring.
Rose smiled, but her heart ached at his words. She didn't feel strong, on the contrary, she felt lost, not knowing how to deal with what was happening inside her.
I was just trying to do what I had to do. But Marcus, there are times in life when you feel like you're losing yourself. And this is one of those moments for me.
Marcus looked at her carefully, his eyes expressing concern and deep concern.
You haven't lost yourself. Aunt Rosa, you're just in a difficult moment. But I'm here, and I'll always be there.
His words penetrated her soul, and at that moment Rose felt that there was more than just an emotional connection between them. It was an attraction that couldn't be ignored.
You have become something very important to me, Marcus, and I do not know what to do with it.
She said the words softly, barely aware of what she was saying, but Marcus nodded without looking away.
You're very important to me too. Aunt Rosa, I think our relationship has become something more than just a family.
Rose held her breath, not believing that these words had actually been uttered. She knew it was wrong, that it violated all norms. But her heart screamed the opposite. She had felt empty and forgotten for a long time, and now, next to Marcus, she felt alive again. There was a long pause, in which both realized that their feelings could not be simple.
We can't. We shouldn't.
But her voice was shaking. and she didn't believe what she was saying. Marcus leaned closer, his eyes shining with sincerity and inner struggle.
I know it's difficult, but I can't pretend that I don't feel anything. You're not just an aunt to me. You are the person who made me stand what true intimacy is.
These words finally broke Rosa. She couldn't ignore what was going on between them anymore. At that moment, she realized that their relationship had gone beyond kinship, and the emotional closeness between Rose and Marcus was growing stronger every day. Their conversations and touches began to carry much more than just support. They both realized that they had crossed the line, but they couldn't stop being caught up in feelings they hadn't experienced in a long time. It has been several weeks since an emotional intimacy began to emerge between Rosa and Marcus, going beyond the usual family relationships. Their conversations, which began as friendly conversations about the past and family memories, gradually became more personal and intimate. They were both aware that something important had changed between them, but so far they had kept quiet about it. Each of them secretly asked themselves questions that had no easy answers. How do they feel about each other? Is this just a moment of weakness or something more? It all started with an innocent touch. It was an ordinary evening when Frank went back to his weekly meeting with friends. Marcus and Rosa were sitting in the kitchen as usual, talking about everyday things. The moment Marcus reached for the cup, their hands accidentally touched. This touch lasted only a moment, but it was enough for something to flare up between them. They both froze, looking at each other, and in their gazes was the realization that everything had changed. Rose felt her heart begin to beat faster. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in years. She knew it was wrong, that her thoughts and feelings for Marcus were unacceptable, but she couldn't get rid of them. With each meeting with her nephew, her attraction to him grew stronger, and the feeling of loneliness she felt around Frank only intensified this desire. She wanted to feel alive, needed, loved again. Marcus, in turn, was also caught up in his feelings. Rosa was no longer just an aunt to him. He saw in her a woman who had once been full of life, but now imprisoned within the framework of her marriage, which had long lost its former passion. He knew that his attraction to her was wrong, but he couldn't deny that their emotional closeness had become something much more to him. The moment their hands touched, he realized that their relationship had long gone beyond simple family communication. After that evening, tension reigned between them. Every time they were alone, this tension became more and more palpable. Their conversations were increasingly accompanied by long looks that didn't need words. They tried to behave as usual, but both knew that it was impossible. Their feelings became obvious, and neither Rose nor Marcus could ignore them anymore. One day, when Frank was at his meeting again, Rosa and Marcus were alone in the living room. They sat in silence, feeling an invisible wall build up between them. Rosa tried to concentrate on reading, but thoughts of Marcus haunted her. He was too close. His presence was literally felt in the air. It was hard for her to focus on anything other than the fact that she was attracted to him. She knew she shouldn't give in to it, but every moment her resistance weakened. Marcus also felt the situation escalating. He couldn't stop thinking about that touch, the looks they'd exchanged over the past few days. He understood that if nothing happened, they would just go crazy from this tension. He needed something to break down that wall between them. And it happened. When Rose got up from the couch, intending to go to the kitchen, she felt Marcus come closer. Their gazes met again, and there was no longer any fear or doubt in that gaze. There was only one wish. Marcus took a step forward and, without waiting for her reaction, gently touched her shoulder. This was the beginning of what they had both been trying to deny for so long. Rose froze. A storm of emotions raged inside her. Her mind screamed that this was unacceptable, that they couldn't continue. But her body wouldn't listen. Her hand reached out to Marcus as if of its own volition, and she felt his arms gently hug her. This touch became the starting point for their passion, which was hidden under the cover of family relations. They stood in silence, their hearts beating in unison, and at that moment, everything else ceased to matter. Marcus gently hugged her to him, and Rose finally allowed herself to relax. She knew that what they were doing was wrong, but at that moment she felt alive. The guilt that should have stopped her was overwhelmed by her passion and desire to be needed. This first moment of intimacy was a turning point. After him, their bond became deeper and more dangerous. They started meeting in secret. Every time Frank went to meet with friends, Rosa and Marcus found time to be alone. Their meetings were full of passion and emotions that Rose had not experienced for a long time. In these moments, she felt young, desirable, and alive. But with that came a sense of guilt. Every time Frank returned home, Rose felt the weight of her actions. She knew she was betraying him. that she was ruining their marriage, but she couldn't stop. Marcus became for her a kind of escape from the routine and loneliness that she had been experiencing for many years. But with each new meeting with him, her guilt grew, and this feeling became more and more unbearable. Marcus was also gripped by contradictions. He understood that their relationship could not last forever, that it was wrong. But every time they were alone, his passion for Rose overcame his mind. He wanted her, and that desire overshadowed everything else. He knew he should have stopped, but he couldn't. Rosa was more than just an aunt to him. She became his emotional support, his love, which he could not ignore. Their relationship developed in the shadows. They hid their connection from everyone, knowing that if the truth came out, it would ruin everything. But every day they spent together only increased their affection for each other. They found solace in these secret meetings, even though each one brought with it a heavy burden of guilt. Months have passed. Their bond has become an integral part of their lives. For Rose, it wasn't just a passion, it was a feeling that her life made sense again. Every time she was with Marcus, she felt younger, stronger, more needed. Marcus found in their relationship not only physical pleasure, but also emotional satisfaction. He was with a woman he respected and loved, even if it was wrong. However, every day their situation became more dangerous. Frank began to notice that Rose had changed. She became more distant, although she tried to hide it. Sometimes he noticed that she held back her gaze when she talked about Marcus. Frank couldn't figure out what was going on, but suspicions began to form in his heart. He felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Rosa's internal conflict has reached its climax. She felt guilty about Frank, but at the same time she couldn't give up on Marcus. This young man gave her what she had long lost in her marriage passion, attention and love. But with that came the inner pain, because she knew that sooner or later it would all end. Their relationship could not last forever, and Rosa realized that she was on the verge of destroying her life. It was at this point that Marcus began to feel that their bond was starting to turn into a burden. He saw Rose suffering from guilt, and it was starting to tear him apart. He could no longer enjoy their secret meetings in peace, because every moment together brought with it the realization that they were destroying everything around them. Frank, always a calm and balanced person, was familiar with the difficulties of life. Over the course of his 60-odd years, he had learned not to notice minor troubles, easily ignored what did not concern him directly. Stability and order were important to him. The house he built with Rosa, their life together, their memories, all this was sacred and inviolable for him. He had never questioned how their marriage had changed in recent decades. It was enough for Frank that they were together. Even if their communication had become routine and their relationship no longer had the same passion, it didn't bother him. But since Marcus had moved in with them, Frank had begun to notice that Rose had changed. At first, he attributed it to the influence of his young nephew. Marcus was energetic, cheerful and full of life plans, and it seemed natural to Frank that his presence brought some animation to the house. He saw that Rosa became more cheerful, smiled more often, laughed, and it even pleased him. It was as if she felt alive again, and Frank was only glad of it. But the more time passed, the more Frank began to worry about how his relationship with Rose had changed. At first it was the little things. Rosa began to leave the house more often, without explaining the reasons. Sometimes she would disappear for a few hours and come back as if nothing had happened. But Frank saw something new in her eyes, something that made him uneasy. Her smile when she looked at Marcus was somehow special, not the same as before. Frank couldn't explain it, but his inner anxiety was growing every day. At night, the Rose began to move away. Frank couldn't remember the last time they had lain in bed next to each other and just talked. She turned her face to the wall more often now, lost in her own thoughts. He tried to find an explanation for her detachment, perhaps age, fatigue, family worries, but deep down he knew it wasn't just that. At some point, Frank began to notice even more alarming signals. Rosa began to pay too much attention to Marcus. She laughed at his jokes, often found an excuse to talk to him, and somehow even became more caring than usual. Sometimes it seemed to Frank that she avoided his gaze when Marcus was around. It was weird. Their house was no longer as cozy and peaceful as it used to be. The atmosphere had changed, and this change was bothering Frank. One evening, when Frank returned home from work earlier than usual, he noticed that Rosa was not at home. Marcus was in the kitchen, and they had a short conversation in which Marcus was clearly nervous. Frank noticed his tension, but didn't pay attention to it. However, Rose soon returned, and Frank felt that she also looked a little worried. He did not ask any questions, but this feeling crept into his soul, new doubts. Since then, Frank has been watching what is happening more closely. He began to pay attention to the details, the way Rose suddenly fell silent when he entered the room, the way Marcus tried to avoid his gaze. These little things accumulated and increasingly poisoned his peace of mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on behind his back, but he didn't know how to approach this problem. The more Frank watched the behavior of Rosa and Marcus, the more worried he became. He couldn't believe that his wife, with whom he had lived together for so many years, could hide something from him. It was impossible. But he knew that his intuition had not failed him. He saw how Rosa began to leave him, how their former intimacy was disappearing. All that remained of their marriage were the shadows of memories and routine duties. One night, Frank was lying in bed listening to Rosa tossing and turning next to him. She seemed restless, as if something was bothering her. He tried to talk to her, but she avoided talking, citing fatigue. Frank realized he couldn't wait any longer. His patience was running out, and he decided he had to find out what was going on. Soon he had a chance. One evening, when Rosa said she was going to meet a friend, Frank decided to follow her. He did not know what to expect, but his anxiety and doubts haunted him. He took the car and drove after her, keeping his distance so that she would not notice him. Rosa was driving to the wrong area where her friend lived, and this immediately alerted Frank. When Rosa stopped at a house on the outskirts of town, Frank couldn't believe his eyes. It was the same house that Marcus had rented since his arrival. Frank saw Rosa get out of the car quickly and enter the house without looking back. At that moment, his heart stopped. He couldn't believe that everything he suspected could be true. But the facts were in front of him. Frank couldn't help himself. In a rage and in a fit of desperation, he got out of the car and headed for the house. His hands were shaking. His mind was filled with corrosive thoughts. As he approached the door, he heard voices from inside. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment he stood in front of the door, not knowing what to do next. He understood that by opening this door, he would change his life forever. Frank abruptly pushed open the door and entered the house. His eyes immediately met what he was afraid to see. Rosa and Marcus were standing too close to each other, and there was something in their eyes that could not be hidden. At that moment, everything fell into place. Their views, their behavior, their secret meetings, all this turned into one obvious betrayal. Frank felt anger boiling up inside him. He couldn't hold himself back any longer.
What the hell is going on here?
Rose froze. Marcus took a step back, but his tense expression betrayed everything. They both knew that this moment was inevitable, but neither of them was prepared for such a development.
Frank, it's not what you think.
But her voice was weak, and even she didn't believe her words. Everything was obvious.
Not what I think. Are you standing here in your nephew's house, away from everyone, and telling me that this is not what I think it is? Do you think I'm an idiot?
The anger was building in his voice, and Frank couldn't hold it in anymore. He was hurt, bitter hurt. He felt his world crumbling. Everything he had built with Rosa throughout their lives turned out to be a lie. Marcus stood in silence, unable to utter a word. He knew this moment would come, but he didn't know how to handle it. He wanted to protect Rose, but he knew that anything he could say would only make the situation worse. Rose lowered her head, unable to meet Frank's gaze. Her heart was bursting with guilt. She knew she had betrayed the man she had spent her whole life with. Frank was her rock, her husband, her friend, but her passion for Marcus outweighed all her obligations to him. Now she saw in front of her not just her husband, but also the man she had deeply wounded.
How could you? How could you betray me like that?
His voice was full of pain, and it was worse than anger. Frank didn't scream. His words were filled with disappointment and bitterness. He didn't understand how a woman he loved and trusted could do this to him. Rosa couldn't answer. She knew that nothing she could say would change what had happened. Frank saw it with his own eyes, and nothing could be fixed. Frank took a step back, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. His gaze slid between Rose and Marcus, and he realized that there was more than just a casual connection between them. It was more than that. He was sickened by the realization of how deep this betrayal had gone.
I thought we were a family. I thought we'd get through everything. But this, it's a betrayal.
He couldn't stay in this house anymore. He had to leave so as not to lose his temper. Frank turned around and walked out, leaving Rose and Marcus in silence. The door slammed shut, and with that sound, their life as it had been before finally collapsed. Rosa and Marcus were left alone in this silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. From the moment Frank left home, it became clear that everything had changed forever. After Frank left the house, Rose remained standing on the doorstep, immersed in deep silence. All the sounds seemed to be swallowed up by this silence, as if the world had stopped, and her life was divided into before and after. A hurricane of emotions raged inside her: guilt, fear, pain. Her world, which she had tried so hard to maintain, was crumbling before her eyes, and now she had to face what she had created herself. The events of the last few months had covered her with a heavy burden that could no longer be ignored. Every day she spent hiding her connection with Marcus had now turned into an endless chain of remorse. She was aware that her election had led to disaster. During these months, Rosa had allowed her feelings to cloud her mind, and now she understood that her life and her husband's life were at stake. When Frank left, Rose was left in the empty house, as if lost. She was alone that evening, even though Marcus was somewhere nearby, but their connection no longer brought her comfort. Every corner of their house reminded her of what she had betrayed. This house was built by her and Frank. Their relationship was once a solid foundation for their family. Now, that foundation was crumbling under her feet, leaving only scattered fragments of memories and feelings. The first thing that struck her was the feeling of loneliness. When she tried to contact Frank, he didn't answer her calls and texts. He left in silence, leaving her no hint of what he was going to do next. It was a blow to Rose because she understood that Frank had not just left, he was turning away from her completely. She realized that his departure meant more than just a temporary escape from pain. It was an attempt to sever all the ties that bound them. Every day Rose became more and more lost in thoughts of what she had lost. She thought about how her life with Frank had been full of simple but important moments that she now regretted. The memories of how they built this house together, how they raised their children, how they went through difficult times, now seemed so far away, almost unreal to her. She realized that she didn't appreciate what she had until she lost it. Her meetings with Marcus, which had previously brought her a sense of joy and novelty, now became a reminder of her weaknesses and wrong decisions. She could no longer find solace in their relationship. Everything that had seemed like a life-giving breath of air to her before was now a source of pain. Marcus was part of this chaos, but she understood that he couldn't offer her what she really wanted. He was young, full of hope for the future, and she, despite her attraction to him, realized that their relationship was doomed from the very beginning. The guilt was getting heavier every day. Rose felt torn between two worlds. On the one hand, there was Frank, the man she had lived with all her life, who was her reliable support. She knew that their relationship had been far from ideal in recent years, but Frank was for her a symbol of stability and loyalty. He was the one who was always there, despite all the difficulties. On the other hand, there was Marcus, with whom she found something new: passion, attention, fresh emotions that she had not experienced for a long time. But now she understood that this passion could not replace what had happened with Frank. Rosa realized that her attraction to Marcus was only a temporary escape from her problems, a way to escape the inner void that had formed in her life. But this void could not be filled with Marcus's youth and energy. It was just an illusion that she had created for herself in order not to face her real problems. Every time Rose thought about how to repair her relationship with Frank, she was overcome with fear. She didn't know if he would forgive her. He was too proud and too deeply wounded to just go back and forget everything. She understood that their marriage would never be the same, even if he agreed to return. Their trust had been destroyed, and she didn't know if she would ever be able to restore it. Nevertheless, she was increasingly inclined to think that she should at least try. Marcus also felt that their relationship was no longer a joy. He realized that everything that happened between them was destroying not only her life, but also his own future. Young and full of plans, he understood that his relationship with Rosa had no future. He felt responsible for what had happened, but he knew he couldn't keep ruining her life. At some point, Rosa and Marcus met to talk. It was one of those meetings that started as something important, but ended in heavy silence. They both knew that their relationship had come to an end. Rosa couldn't pretend anymore that she wanted to be with Marcus. Her heart belonged to Frank, even if she realized it too late. When Marcus left, Rosa was left alone, lost in her own thoughts. Now she had to decide what to do next. Her life couldn't be the same anymore, but she knew she had to find the strength to at least try to fix it. She began to think about how to restore her relationship with Frank. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that she might have to face his unrelenting pain and anger. But she also knew that if she didn't take this step, she would lose him forever. As the days passed, Rose began to write a letter to Frank. Her hands were shaking as she wrote every word, but she knew that this was her only chance to get her thoughts across to him. In the letter, she wrote about her pain, her remorse, and how much their past meant to her. She did not ask for forgiveness directly, knowing that this was too big a step for him. She just wanted him to understand that she was aware of her guilt and was willing to do anything to try to get their relationship back, even if it took a long time. When she sent the letter, she felt some relief, but the fear of his reaction did not let her go. She didn't know if he would answer her, but she was ready for any outcome. The important thing was that she took the first step. A few days passed, and Rose continued to live in the silence that Frank had left behind. The house that had once been filled with life now seemed empty and cold to her. She could no longer ignore her guilt, but at the same time she felt that maybe she had a chance to fix everything. Frank did not reply to her letter immediately. There was a struggle going on inside him too. He was wounded and did not know if he would ever be able to forgive Rosa for her betrayal. But deep down, he still loved her, despite everything that had happened. Their years together couldn't just be erased from his life, but the pain of betrayal was too fresh to immediately give an answer. And so, one day when Rose had almost lost hope, she received a letter from Frank. He didn't write much. There was no promise of forgiveness in his words, but there was something more in understanding that their relationship deserved another chance, if only for the sake of the years they had lived together. Rosa, reading his letter, felt tears on her cheeks. It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was a chance. And she knew that she was ready to do anything to take this chance. Now she had a long way to go. She understood that their lives would never be the same, that they would both have to learn to live with what had happened. But she had a faint hope that maybe they could start over, that their love, despite all the blows, could survive. Rosa's story ended not on a note of complete reconciliation, but on a note of reflection. She understood that much was lost forever, that her mistakes had left traces that could not be erased. But now she knew that the future had not yet been definitively determined. There was a chance in her life, at least a slim one, for redemption.